After days of will he, won't he, it is now official. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not come to India for the G20 Summit next month. The Russian president's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov today told the Russian media, President Putin is not planning a trip to attend the G20 Summit in India, which will be held in September. The main emphasis now is on the special military operation, a reference to the Ukraine conflict. The Kremlin says the format of Putin's participation in the G20 summit will be determined later. Putin attended the recently concluded BRICS summit in South Africa via video conference. He was represented by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. As the G20 president, India is hosting the G20 summit in New Delhi on the 9th and 10th of September. The summit is likely to be attended by 29 heads of state and top EU officials and invitee guest countries, as well as 14 heads of international organizations. A G20 leaders' declaration will be adopted at the conclusion of the New Delhi summit. Now, the last time the Russian president attended the G20 summit in person was all the way back in 2019 in Osaka, Japan. This development is significant as the G20 summit in Delhi will be attended by major leaders of Western countries, including US President Joe Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron, who have imposed heavy sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi will be the second consecutive G20 summit that the Russian president has chosen to skip since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Earlier, he stayed away from the G20 summit in Bali last year. Also, during the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Vladimir Putin did not attend the G20 summit. Now, geopolitical experts have pointed out that the Russian president is shying away from international events, especially if they include Western leaders, as he does not want to engage in a direct face-off with the leaders of those countries. Professor Harsh Pant, Vice President of Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, says the decision is symbolic of Russia's isolation on the global stage, as Vladimir Putin is not able to visit even friendly nations now. The Russian administration is avoiding public humiliation in the aftermath of Ukraine's invasion. Moreover, the death of Wagner Group chief Yevgeny Prigozhin denotes that not everything is fine with Russia's internal security, and President Putin may even have doubts about his own security traveling abroad. All right, so what does this really mean? To understand that, let's now go across to Ramakrishna Sridharan, consulting editor with News9. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Global Lens. Shri, even though most would agree that this doesn't really come as a surprise, Putin has been staying away from international events for a while now, at least since the invasion of Ukraine, including the BRICS summit. But you know, it's interesting how this particular expert, who we just quoted, points out that in a sense, this decision on part of the Kremlin, that Putin is not even going to come to Delhi, completes Putin's isolation on the global stage, given that he is no longer able to even visit friendly countries. What ramifications do you think his absence from the G20 summit in New Delhi is likely to have?
Well, Neha, this is basically in continuation of his isolation from the global community ever since the war against Ukraine was launched by Russia. The only big, visit that Putin paid before, just days before the launch of the war, was his trip to China, where he ostensibly went to attend the Winter Olympics. But before that, he also signed a no-limits barred partnership with China, if you recall, even as troops were amassing on the Russia-Ukraine border. So ever since, Mr. Putin has not traveled, outside of Russia or outside of the old USSR. He has attended a few meetings of friendly neighboring countries, so he hasn't traveled outside. So I think the price of readmission of Mr. Putin back into the international community will really be the cessation of war against Ukraine. So I think that's the price the global community wants to extract from Mr. Putin before he's welcomed back in whatever fashion into the global community, Neha.
One more question to you, Shri, before we move on from the subject of the G20 summit. Every top official who I've interviewed this week insists that India's focus is on the global south, the needs of those countries and the challenges faced by the developing world. They say we want to steer clear of geopolitics. But we all know that geopolitics, whether anyone likes it or not, has cast a long shadow on most multilateral summits since the invasion of Ukraine in particular. It happened in Bali last year. It's almost inescapable for New Delhi as well. Given that top Western leaders, including the US President, are going to be here, how do you think India is going to manage this, shall we say, tightrope walk as the host of G20?
Right. So, Neha, as a nation, I mean, our invitation stands to Mr. Putin, but obviously Russia is not going to accept that and he's not going to be there. So I think our role pretty much is clear. We are independent and we have our independent interests. And we have no problem in working with countries. Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, has very clearly said this is, dialogue should take precedence over any kind of military action in the case of Ukraine. So I think India's stance is very clear. And it's up to Mr. Putin to see how he wants to really resolve this issue and whether he values belonging to an international community and, getting rid of all the sanctions and putting Russia back on good terms with the Western nations. That's entirely up to him. But knowing Mr. Putin, I think he has a point of view and he calls it Ukraine war. He calls it something that has been foisted by, the Western nations on Russia because of the threatened membership of Ukraine to NATO. So, so it's not really India's battle to fight in that sense, Neha. We are a host nation and our intention is to bring countries together and look at ways in which these countries can cooperate for the benefit of the entire world. So I think I will not put the entire burden on India. I think it's up to Russia to make the next move in this case, Neha.
Right. But, considering that China is a country that has quite publicly defended Russia on multiple occasions, even over its invasion of Ukraine, I think the million-dollar question is, can there be a consensus amongst all the G20 member states as far as the New Delhi Declaration is concerned? Because there were certainly issues with regard to the Bali Declaration last year. Let's see how that pans out.